Good afternoon. My name is Christy Peeler. I'm going to be conducting an interview based off of my PowerPoint that I turned in based on the legal and ethical issues in nursing. This is my friend Brittany Carr. She's going to be helping me out. She is a coworker in the ER. She's been working a little bit over 2 years now, so she has a little bit more experience than I do, but we're going to be conducting this interview. So, the first one we're going to start with is the legal issue in nursing that I covered, which is medical malpractice. So, do you know what medical malpractice is?
It's like when um, a nurse or healthcare provider causes harm to a patient and then they could possibly get sued for that.
Right. So, a patient or the patient's family member can sue a nurse or the physician based off something that caused harm to a patient. Now, this can be something that they actually did, or it can be something that they kind of ignored and it just happened to happen. So, coming off of that, nurses are most commonly accused of what kind of malpractice, do you think?
Um, if I had to guess, it would probably be negligence, just due to not having all the information that they should have whenever doing some kind of skill in the nursing setting.
Exactly. So, negligence, like I just said, is something that the nurse didn't actively do, but while the patient was in the nurse's care, something happened to the patient so that the family or the patient themselves can in turn sue the hospital or the physician or the nurse. They can put any of those people on the actual lawsuit, but usually that is based off the nurse because they are technically in their care. All right, so do you know like what kind of physician is most at risk for malpractice suits?
Um, I would think surgeons, just because they have a lot more protocols. Like they have to do a timeout and everything, and if you forget that, then they're more at risk to cause harm, and you can't really undo some things that they do. So
Right, yeah. So surgeons, just because of the aspect of their care, every patient has to sign a general consent for surgery, but sometimes the injuries that happen during the surgery is not covered in the general consent. So that in itself can be a lawsuit waiting to happen for a surgeon, which is why they are most at risk. So, do you know some of the ways that your workplace tries to protect you from getting a lawsuit?
I know policies and procedures would be something that the hospital would have or facility would have in place to help prevent us from doing certain things. Um, that's really the only one that I can think of. So.
Right. So policies and procedures are there because they are clinically based to help the patient the most and cause the least amount of harm. Another way that the hospital protects us from getting sued, basically, is the nurse to patient ratios. So in our ER that we work in, we have a 3-to-1 patient to nurse ratio. So usually every nurse has 3-to-1. Now, if we have an intensive care patient that we are holding in the ER, that's usually 1-to-1, and the other nurses usually just have to pick up the slack for the patients that we don't take. But we work in a 9-bed ER. It's not that big, so we usually only have one intensive care patient at the time, anyways. So that's not really that big of a deal. But so what are some ways that you can think you can protect yourself from malpractice suits?
Charting would probably be the most important one, just because that's showing that you did something and how you did it and things like that.
Right. And we learned that the very first semester in nursing school. Charting, charting, charting. If you didn't chart it, it didn't happen. And that's also one of the ways that nurses get accused of malpractice suits is because they don't chart as often as they should. And whenever you go to court, they don't think about, oh, you had this patient going on at the same time that you had this patient right here that we're talking about. And they don't think about it the same way that we do. And if you're having to sit in court and you're having to go over the chart and you've only charted on this patient like every 4 hours, they're going to be like, why did you only chart on this patient every 4 hours? They don't care that you had other patients at a time. So it's just that's one important way that you can protect yourself. Following the standard procedures of care, following policies and procedures, being sure that you chart that is another important way that we can protect ourselves from getting lawsuits. So another way that we can protect ourselves from lawsuits is by having our own malpractice insurance. So the hospital has their own lawyer, but nurses can get their own malpractice insurance, which is about $100 a year. Do you happen to carry that kind of insurance?
I don't. I really don't know that much about it. I mean, I know that you can get it, and I've heard that it's a good thing, that other nurses have had it, but I've never really looked into it that much.
Yeah. Which I'm part of a group online that all ER nurses across the nation are in, and there was a discussion about this probably about a week ago actually, and they were arguing the case of whether having malpractice insurance was good or bad. They were saying it was good because the one time that they ever got sued in their 35-year career, this was very helpful. But they've also been cases where the lawyers in the case would figure out that they had their own malpractice insurance, and the hospital would be like, oh no, that was just the nurse. That had nothing to do with the hospital. So they would take the hospital's name off of the lawsuit and just put the nurse's name because, they found out that they had the extra amount of money. So,
well, that's terrible.
Yeah. So that's something to think about. I am personally looking into getting my own, just in case, because the hospital lawyers only look out for the hospital. That is their client. They're not looking out for us per se. They're just looking out for the hospital's sake. So I feel like if it ever came down to it, then, it would kind of be up to us to protect ourselves. So that's something I'm definitely looking into. So among of all the malpractice suits, there is one exception to the suits. Do you know what that is?
The Good Samaritan law.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So the Good Samaritan law is something that any personnel with a license, if they are out in public and they see something, somebody collapse, if you go up to them and you start CPR, if you do things that are within your scope of practice, then you are protected from getting sued for malpractice. But, if you try to do something, like crike somebody, then, that's something that's kind of questionable that you can probably get sued for because that's out of your practice, even though that's something that could help the patient at the time if they had an obstructed airway. But, that's something that was also recently in the news, but something to think about. All right. So the next topic that I covered, which is my ethical part of my issues, was withholding info from the patient whenever the family requests it. Like, if you have an elderly patient and they get diagnosed with a disease that could end in death, the family may ask you not to tell them that, in order to keep their hopes up and not be focused on that. So, have you ever been asked to withhold information from a patient?
I have kind of. It was with a child, and the parent didn't want the child to know, exactly what was going on. I think it was like they were gonna have to go to surgery or something like that, and then they thought that the child would be scared, and so they just didn't want us to say anything. There is actually a situation with my church right now that there was an elderly woman that was recently put into a hospice program, and they won't tell her that it's a hospice program. They think that it should just be called like a new course of treatment that they're trying, and they won't really explain to her that, hey, you really don't have that much longer. This is supposed to help comfort you and things like that. And I don't feel like that's right because it's, not fair to the patient because they should have an active role in deciding what is going on with their health care.
I agree. Especially in the case of elderly patients, I feel like they have the right to know. I know whenever I was doing this PowerPoint, I read an article where a Hispanic gentleman had his elderly father in a chemotherapy program, but he didn't want the physician that was administering the chemotherapy to tell the patient, but he just wanted to tell the patient that it was antibiotics. See, I feel like that that the elderly person is a grown person and that he should be explained the risk and the benefits of the chemotherapy. He shouldn't just be subjected to that kind of thing, just because his son is taking care of him right now, But there are a couple ways that you can try and prevent this kind of case from happening. Now, it kind of has to have some forethought. It can't be something that they show up to the ER like we usually see. Like, they can't just show up to the ER and us solve that problem. It usually takes a lot of primary care visits and that kind of thing. But are there any ways that you could think of that you could prevent that kind of dilemma from happening?
definitely.
Yeah. Like I said, it's really hard to do it like on the spot like we have to do in the ER. But if they go to a primary care physician regularly, they can have the conversation with the patient and with the family before that kind of illness happens, and they can be like, hey, how do you want to get your information? Do you want us to tell your family first, or do you want to know first? Do you want to know any of the bad things, or do you just want to know the good things? That kind of thing. So I know you don't really agree with not telling the patient, but could you understand maybe why the family wouldn't want the patient to know?
I mean, I do. I understand that they, if it was a diagnosis that would more than likely end up in death, I understand them wanting the patient to still have hope that things are going to get better and not just give up. And because a lot of people perceive that as they'll die sooner if they give up hope and stuff like that. So I do understand. I don't agree with it, but I do understand why they would do it.
Yeah. So there are also some cultures that only want this kind of thing to happen. Could you think of a culture that does this?
I would think possibly like Hispanic or Native American culture.
Yep, Hispanics, and I do believe that Native Americans also practice this, but just because Hispanics are the most common culture that we see here, that is the one I know most about. Hispanics often wish that the family takes care of the patient, especially if they're elderly. The family believes, oh, this elder took care of us when we were young, so now that we're in the position where we can take care of them, we should do that for them. And yeah, so that is pretty much everything I have, and thank you for helping me out with this interview.
You're welcome.
All right, thank you.